Okay, shall we begin? Welcome to this inaugural lecture. My name's Jeff Haywood. I am pleased to be hosting Professor Martin Chick's inaugural lecture this evening. It's actually really nice to see such a lovely packed room, and as I was saying to Martin, this has changed enormously since the days of the old medical school, which is undoubtedly an improvement. Martin Chick grew up in Bishop Stortford, which he describes as then a rural market town, and modestly said he went to his local university, which was Cambridge. I actually tried to decide if Luton was closer to Bishop Stortford, but I think you're probably right. Whilst at Cambridge, he studied history, and his friends were studying economics, and so from that his fusion of history and in economics, and which have been his interests ever since, have come forward. He then taught history in schools and applied economics also, before switching back into academic life, going to LSE to study for his PhD in economic history. During his PhD, he was appointed to what he described as an O-style tenured lectureship, which I'm sure that some of us older ones do indeed remember, at the University of Edinburgh. Completed his PhD and produced an edited book, a monograph on Attlee's industrial policy. And actually, it's interesting looking down the list of things that Martin has talked about, that he's ranged, really quite significantly over the years of his work, beginning with Attlee's government industrial policy, going on to French electricity tariffs post-war, fisheries, whaling, law of the sea, and now into caring with the future as part of an AHRC project in divinity. Outside academic life, he's influenced policy, most recently by traveling to China and giving, as he said, meetings and banquets in hotels, power stations and cement works, which I'm sure was enormously interesting, but probably also very influential. And then at the Department of Energy and Climate Change and the Treasury, advising on taxation of wealth. So for this evening's lecture, Martin's going to talk about the work on his final volume on the Oxford Economic History of Britain, and in particular the interaction between time, economics and policy making. So I'd like you to welcome with me Professor Martin Chick to his lecture, The Times They Are A-Changin, Time, Economics and a Political Economy of Britain since 1945. Martin.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. Very kind words. And thank you to everyone for coming, despite the weather. Come on, Patrick. So I know there are many in this room to whom I owe many personal academic debts of support and debts of friendship. But as you know, I'm not a good-looking, leather-jacketed Greek finance minister, so I haven't come here to reschedule debts. And you'll just have to wait for me to pay those back over a lifetime. And if I can take the mantra used by football managers or their translators, which is that it would be invidious to single out individuals, and then like football managers, I will now proceed to do so. And the first person is my mum. Now, obviously, I'm very grateful to my parents, my family, but my mum died at the end of last year, and I just want to really pay tribute to her. This is my mum. She did grow up taller than that. Roller skating on the streets of Shanghai. Not something you probably do very much anymore. That childhood was put a stop to by the Japanese mortaring Shanghai. They then put into the seas at the time of Pearl Harbor. The ships were bombed either side, and they put into the Philippines, where they were disembarked and the ships moved away. The Japanese then invaded the Philippines, and they were put into an internment camp. And the children were separated from the parents for 33 months. They were liberated by MacArthur. You should see my mum at the Edinburgh tattoo. Proud American. They went to San Francisco, where her mother died of TB. They then really, I suppose, as refugees, came to Scotland, eventually ended up in London, went to Pitman's Shorthand College, as women did in those days, and eventually had me in Parsons Green, which was the less salubrious part of Fulham, when Fulham was even less salubrious than it is now. And all I want to say is absolutely worked her socks off to give me every chance. So I'm incredibly grateful to her and a huge privilege to have known her. And the other strong woman in my life is Hattie, who is my wife. And when I was school teaching and doing 35 periods a week and going home with essays on my little bicycle and then trying to write my own research in the meantime, or in the spare time, it was really Hattie who encouraged me to go back to do research. And we got married, I threw in my career, my job, went back to the LSE, or went to the LSE, and I spent the next 2-3 years sitting in archives, scribbling, looking at windows in libraries, while Hattie went to work to keep me to the level I don't deserve. And really nothing has changed ever since. So I am incredibly grateful to Hattie, and I would want to say that. And of course, without Hattie, this wouldn't be happening. And therefore, if you don't like it, all complaints should go to Hattie. All right, so what are we going to discuss? Well, this is obviously another one of your bucket lists of things to hear about for an hour before you die. It's something called gross domestic fixed capital formation. Now, Nick Phillipson did ask me, I think 2 months ago, were there any jokes in this inaugural? And I was able to assure him no, because it was, of course, an economic history inaugural, and therefore it's beyond joking. And I'm therefore going to spend, really to prove that, about 50 minutes talking about what we call GDFCF. So what is gross domestic fixed capital formation? Well, it's that. And what GDFCF means, it means it's gross, so it's investment without taking any cognizance of repairs, depreciation, wear and tear of what it is that you're addressing. It's domestic because it's the UK. It's fixed capital, which means that it's really things that you can touch. So factories, plant and machinery, houses. I don't know if you're into touching factories, there's probably a website for you, but it's that sort of fixed capital. And crucially, it's formation. It's a flow of investment, which then at the end of the year adds to the existing stock. So GDFCF, and you can see its importance over the best part of the century. As a factor of production, it just increases in proportion over that time. And it usually breaks down into various sectors. So this is what you might expect. This is private sources of investment. And these essentially are general declines in government and what's called public corporation, but what we used to call socialized industries, nationalized industries. Now, what that line chart doesn't really pick up is that across the war, World War II, there was actually quite a shift in the distribution by source of these various forms of investment. So if you look at the private sector, it's higher as a proportion in the interwar period, but then drops down. Local authorities much the same, but you then get these increases in public corporations, nationalized industries, and also to an extent in the central government, whatever that is. So across the war, there was a shift upwards in what the state did. And then, in the post-war period, there was a steady collapse in what the state did. So this is a measure of net investment conducted by the public sector at the end of the last century. And it's virtually zero. It is down to naught. It's actually 0.5%. And it's really that which I want to try and start to explain, not only because it's of interest in itself, what I've told you it's of interest, you would have to take my word for that, but also because it does address the bigger question which absorbs British economic historians, which is how in general do we move from that collectivist provisionist state, the governments of Attlee that gave you council houses, nationalised industries, etc., to the current state, which by the end of the century seemed to be giving you very little indeed, was actually putting very little net investment into the economy. Well, at some point in investment, you have to go back to the 1930s. And that means you have to look at the works of Keynes and Hayek, John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek. Now, you can overdo the differences between Keynes and Hayek. Keynes was very helpful to Wittgenstein in getting Wittgenstein to start his PhD at Cambridge. Wittgenstein was Hayek's second cousin. When Hayek was being bombed in London, it was Keynes who found him accommodation in Cambridge. When Hayek wrote his book, The Road to Serfdom, which is what he becomes known for, Keynes writes and says, what a fantastic book. I really approve of this. So the common notion that Keynes and Hayek are at loggerheads is really untrue. But like good academics, they were well able, when reviewing one another's books, to have a jolly good bash at them. So, for example, when Keynes wrote A Treatise of Money in 1931, Hayek treated himself to a two-part review, not just one-part review, a two-part review to really dig into it. And equally, when Hayek wrote Prices and Production in 1931, Keynes was happy to dismiss it as one of the most frightful muddles he had ever read. So they remained on good terms in a sense, they just criticised each other's competence in economics. So let's start with Hayek. Hayek was brought to Britain by Lionel Robbins in 1931. Lionel Robbins was then the youngest professor of economics in the UK, and Robbins was able to read German and had read a lot of Hayek's work in Germany. Robbins himself had been in dispute with Keynes on the Economic Advisory Council, this council that ran from 29 to 31, and therefore he was beginning to draw unto himself an anti-Keynesian team. And for the economists, I'll just remind you that also Cowdell and Hicks were also at the LSE at the same time. So it's just a private conversation. So Hayek was brought to the LSE, and he gave these 4 lectures in Prices and Production. Hayek really then spent the next 10 years writing about little else except capital investment. And he finished in 1941 with his book, The Pure Theory of Capital. So we now think about Hayek, political economist, The Road to Serfdom, law, constitution and liberty, whatever it was. But in fact, the 30s he spent deep in economic theory. So what did Keynes and Hayek disagree about in this area of capital investment? Hayek's view, like that of Keynes, was that there was a natural rate of interest, a rate of interest which would exist in an equilibrating market. But that bankers, and let's blame bankers, would overlend such that there would then appear a market rate of interest which was below the natural rate of interest. Now for Hayek, the rate of interest was a bridge between the present and the future. In a sense, your willingness to postpone consumption, not to have an ice cream now, but to have an ice cream in another year's time, was affected by the amount of extra interest you were going to get in the following years, the extra ice creams that you were about to get. I've explained that very badly, but let's just move on. So essentially, there was this view for Hayek that the rate of interest was, if you like, an indicator of people's valuation of the future in terms of the present. And the lower the rate of interest, the more willing they were to invest, because the less concerned they were about this trade-off between present and future. And therefore, the lower rate of interest, the more they would invest in heavy capital equipment. So rather than buy a spade, they would invest in a JCB digger. It would take longer to come to fruition, but its productivity would be higher. Now, it therefore meant that when this market rate of interest, which was below the natural rate of interest, was realized by the investors as being false, as sending a false signal about the future, and they abandoned investment projects, you therefore got a depression, decline in economic activity. But Hayek's view was that there was nothing you could do about that. You had to wait for the market rate of interest to come back into line with the natural rate of interest. And therefore you get this very much standoffish, what's called a nomocratic point of view, which is that you simply you let the market come back to a natural state. Now, Keynes fundamentally disagreed with this. He didn't disagree that there was a natural rate of interest, and he didn't disagree that interest rates were important, although he thought they told you more about the form in which people were prepared to hold assets. Did they want cash? Did they want equity? Did they want houses? This liquidity preference. But Keynes thought that someone's willingness to invest wasn't really guided by the view of the future as indicated by the rate of interest, but was guided by expectations of the rate of return on the investment which was undertaken, what he lovingly called the marginal efficiency of investment or capital. And we know that this is a crucial point in Keynes because Richard Kahn, who developed the multiplier in 1930, which is important to Keynes, really points to chapter 11 of the general theory as being the key issue. Now, Keynes saw a role for the state in influencing this expected rate of return. So you're not going to invest unless you think you're going to get something back. And the state can influence this marginal rate of return. So if we want to look at some of Keynes's writings on this, these are both from the general theory. He talks here about the marginal efficiency of capital. Does that work? Well, it does work and you can't see it. Anyway, he talks about the marginal efficiency of capital. But notice the skepticism about the success of monetary policy. He thinks you need to be doing more. What do you need to be doing and what should the state be doing? Well, in the general theory, he begins to talk, and I've put it in bold for you, about the socialization of investment, that the state should be getting some sort of influence over the safer forms of investment so as to lift the expected rate of return, so as to induce people to invest. But he is very clear that he is not arguing for socialism, state socialism. Now, remember, Keynes has very good or reasonably good information about Soviet Union socialism. He's married a Russian ballerina, Lydia Lopakova. He goes to the Soviet Union a lot. He writes tracts about communism and Russia, etc. But he's saying here that we don't want the ownership of production. It's not ownership that we're actually looking for. It's an influence on expected rates of return. All right, we'll pause there for a little brief rest. It wasn't that bad, Dale. All right, this is a mini break. If you want a really accessible guide to some of these issues, this is a fantastic bedtime read. Oakes and Asler Beguai. It's got international politics, it's got sex, and it's got the multiplier. I mean, what else do you need? Strongly recommended as a good bedtime read. All right, back to it. So we said that Keynes didn't want socialization. He didn't want the ownership of the means of production taken over by the state. But of course, that is what we got. That when a Labour government was elected in 1945, it nationalised railways, electricity, gas, etc., etc., to the extent that it came to enjoy control over about a fifth of total investment. Now, one of Keynes's sometime friends, a man called Dennis Robertson, noted this. Now, Robertson had been very important to Keynes, but they'd fallen out in the writing of the general theory, in the run-up to the general theory. And indeed, Keynes, who could be very petty, Keynes doesn't thank Robertson in the preface to the general theory, which is pretty poor stuff. I mean, academics, they read the back of the book, see their names in it, then they read the preface, then they read conclusion, then they read the introduction, and the bit in the middle they just sort of put to one side and hope they read through osmosis. So he refuses to include Robertson in the preface. But Robertson is very good on this, and he says, the Labour government, it isn't really about the NHS. The NHS doesn't build a new hospital till 10 years of existence, not till 1955. The first hospital comes in. And it's not really about social security and the welfare state, because the scheme that Beveridge gives, the social insurance scheme, is a very mean and niggardly scheme. It is just an insurance scheme. You know, would you buy insurance cover off me? Would you buy it off Beveridge? Probably not. It's not the welfare state that we now recognise. But the crucial issue for Robertson is this assumption of control over capital investment, this assumption of control in time between the present and the future. Now, this degree of state intervention into the control of capital investment began to bother economists within government. So a very famous one, to economist James Mead, was working as an economic advisor at the time, and having to deal with Herbert Morrison, who was the Lord President in the Labour government. And he wasn't able to persuade Morrison of the economic rationality of structures of pricing. Morrison was very tricky and didn't always play it straight. Luckily, those qualities haven't come through to his grandson, Peter Mandelson. But there were big debates within that, and between Mead and Coas, and Ian Little wrote a big book about the price of fuel, etc., etc. And what bothered the Treasury was that in industries like electricity, so electricity is your biggest nationalised industry, it's 8% of total investment. You didn't actually have control over the amount of investment that that industry would absorb. Why not? Because you didn't control pricing. That whole post-war economy, as you know from, I don't know what it would be, post-Dad's Army type programs, is a rationed economy. Now, a rationed economy to an economist doesn't mean there are shortages, it just means there aren't adequate prices. You can always clear the market, it just means that some people don't eat. But essentially, this is a rationed economy without prices within it. Now, not pricing electricity matters, because not only does it mean that in the current time you tend to use the less efficient sets to generate total output, but crucially, it means that at the peak, if you can't control the peak, you have to keep building more and more power stations, because clearly you don't want to have blackouts. Now, this failure to control the peak really revolved around the issue of electric fires. So it's a rationed economy. There is coal rationing in Britain until 1958. It's that bad. And the middle class who have electricity go out and buy electric fires. They're 30 shillings each. Don't ask me why I know that stuff. They're 30 shillings each. They plug them in and they heat themselves up. And the poor, meanwhile, struggle on ration coal, and that's tough in Labour's middle class Britain. Now, these space heaters, the electric heaters, they form a fifth of total load, but 3/5 of the peak. So the obvious sensible thing is to price away the peak, to actually put the peak hour price up at certain times a day, or peak hour times a day, and get people to not use them as much. And people are using them to heat their second bedrooms or their bedrooms upstairs. They're not using them wholly in the main room. Now, this is a government which has just nationalised its industry, which owns it, and therefore you would think it could tell it what to do. Well, it tells the industry, put up your time of day pricing. And the industry says no. It says we won't do that, it's not in the people's interest. What was really going on was that there was a huge housing boom at the time, and the electricity industry, which couldn't store its output, knew there was a very tight relationship between peak hour demand and investment requirements. But it was in competition with the gas industry. The gas industry also offered heating and cooking, etc., etc. And of course, gas you can store. These lovely towers that sit outside Glasgow and other places in Granted, they store off-peak production for peak hour use. So gas was at a real advantage here. Nonetheless, this is a problem for the government. So Gateskill, who was taken over as Minister of Fuel and Power, fresh from the LSE, he does what ministers do. He calls a committee, establishes a committee called the Cloud Committee. And this essentially says that it wants data from the electricity industry about what is the price, the elasticity of peak hour demand. How responsive is peak hour demand to price increases? And the industry says, no, we don't have that data anymore. We did have it, but we've lost it. You can't have it. What we're beginning to get here is the first sign of a troubled relationship between a government and a nationalised industry, because the nationalised industry isn't just nationalised, it's a monopoly. It has not quite the monopoly, but it has most of the information you need to know about the industry. Eventually, they abandoned the time of day issue and they moved to a winter-summer peak split. So at least in winter, you get to pay a bit more. But the electricity boards forget to tell people about this, and when they come to pay their bills retrospectively, there's no difference in demand, and therefore they claim there was no price elasticity of demand anyway. Now, the crucial point here is that there is a fallacy here in thinking that ownership, nationalisation, gives you control. What in fact has happened is that ownership has given you enhanced responsibility for an industry that has the monopoly of all the information you require to run it, and which, if you move against it by, say, cutting or reducing its budget, will go to the press and say, ministers cut off pensioners at peak hour, etc., etc. So there's a huge problem here about not being able to control that for which you are responsible. And Gateskill, when Labour lose the election in 1951, goes off, back to LSE, the type of things, and also to see George Smiley's Anne, probably not repeatable, ask me afterwards, but essentially goes off and writes a tract about socialisation and nationalisation. And that forms the basis for Tony Crosland's book, The Future of Socialism, which is the first book to come out and say Labour needs to abandon monopoly-style nationalisation. It comes straight out of the energy issue. So you have here something entirely unsatisfactory. Your largest user of capital investment resources is charging prices which are too low, which do not reflect the cost of supplying at the peak, and therefore you're building more and more power stations. That's a problem that's got to be solved. But that is as nothing to the other problem with electricity, which is going on in Scotland. The North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board is formed in 1943. And the idea is that it rains in Scotland, and therefore when the rain falls, you collect the rain and you run it through turbines spin, and the Highlands get lots of cheap electricity and revives. Well, yes and no. These are not Canadian St. Lawrence run-of-the-river schemes where the river sweeps by and you divert a bit and send it through pipes and turbines spin and you just have a constant supply of river electricity. This involves going around the Highlands, blowing it up. So there's huge explosions all over the Highlands in the late 40s as people make environmentally friendly energy. You then have these immense constructed puddles, you let the water out, the turbines spin, and then you have to pump the water back up. So this isn't really a very efficient way to make electricity. It's incredibly expensive to do it this way in terms of capital. So almost 10% of the electricity board's capital in the first 10 years goes to hydro. It gets backing from, yes, Herbert Morrison. It seems to politicians a good idea. It takes 10% of all investment, but it's at most going to deliver about 2.5% of output. The Treasury is again deeply concerned at this misuse of capital. Well, what to be done? What to be done about an electricity industry that you can't price properly at the peak, and a hydro board which just seems to be having a party up there, blowing holes in the Highlands? Indeed, Peter Payne calls the 1953 investment programme frenzied. There were 14 new hydro systems being built at one and the same time. Well, it's at this point that the Treasury begin to note what's been happening in France. Now, the French have had similar issues. They've come out of the war, which they lost. Don't tell the French, but they lost. They certainly didn't win it. And they have these same electricity issues arising. The first French plan is the Monet Plan, 47 to 52, in which they go for a hydroelectric scheme of electricity. And this becomes severely criticised by economists, or as they're called in France, ingénieur economists, because the alternative is what's called thermal, to have power stations which burn coal and quite possibly oil. Why are hydro schemes favoured in France? Well, it's partly tradition. There's the Alps, the spring melts, the rivers run down, and you can fix the hydros up. There are natural lakes, you can run hydros out of them. All those thermal places you go and lie about if you're into that sort of thing with cucumbers in your eyes and mud. A lot of those are thermal works. But in fact, it's become very obvious, as in Britain, that it makes much more sense to interconnect systems, to put them together and then start to run a merit order throughout the whole system. Well, now, the French, after the Monet Plan, really begin to address this. And the man who really makes the lead here is Pierre Massé, who develops what's called La Note Bleue, which is a guide to how you invest or how you do capital investment, comparing hydro works with capital works. Now, Massé makes a very important, well, not breakthrough here, but point to politicians. Massé is influenced by von Neumann and Morgenstern, all these people that were talking to him, and Tobin. So, Massé begins to take hydroeconomics apart. So traditional economics says, well, hydro is very good because you get your money back. You build the thing, it costs you a fortune, but it lasts 100 years, and then essentially it just pays you back with all this free electricity forever afterwards. It helps, of course, if you can pay low rates of interest to build it in the first place. Massey begins to argue that this is an inappropriate way to think about large capital investment projects because their longevity is actually a source of risk. It's a risk in the sense that they may become technologically redundant. There may be much smarter ways in future to make electricity other than hydro. And indeed, there were to be. We were ultimately to end up with nuclear, whatever you think about nuclear, but also conventional sets simply became more and more efficient. But also Massey says that you should really be thinking about this in terms of this technological obsolescence. So, for example, he would say, well, canals still survive. So you could say canals last a long time, but we no longer use canals as we used to. They've simply been supplanted by other things. And what Massey really begins to push is the idea that you should look ahead. You should think ahead to what the returns on your investment project are going to be. Now, looking ahead in economics is a deep philosophical issue because returns that come in the future are held to be worth less than the money you can have now. So, do you want £1 now, or do you want £1.10 in 4 years' time? Well, it depends upon your preference between now and the future. And there are reasons why you might prefer now. The first and most obvious is you might be dead in 4 years' time. So there's what we call in the climate change, Nick Stern's climate change report, the asteroid factor. You might just be blown apart and therefore that's gone. There's the fact you actually might be richer, and therefore the £1 for the ice cream in 4 years' time is of less interest to you than the £1 for the ice cream now. And there's also just sheer impatience, which philosophers decry, but seems to be a very natural thing. I want the ice cream now. So in thinking about future returns, you begin to discount. You begin to say, well, we're going to get £1.10 in 4 years' time, but what's the rate of interest? What's the discount rate we're going to apply to that? And of course, once you apply that to hydro sets, you stop building them because the return's projected 30, 40, 50 years away. And once you put a compound discount rate back into that, it's very difficult to justify them at all. And that's even before you start making comparisons with other forms of generation. Anyway, all this is going on, as indeed is work by Marcel Boissieu in sorting out electricity pricing. Why do the French get time of day peak hour pricing? Well, A, the French are held to have lost the war. De Gaulle tells them often that they are not worthy of La France. There's a huge emphasis in the planning on industrial modernization, so not domestic households. And also French households, if you put too many things on, they just go fat anyway. So there's a natural self-limiter. Also, Boissieu's tariff vert, which he had to get through politicians, fortunately coincided with the Suez crisis in '56, when they were very oil energy minded, and therefore they bought it. So you have in France, really, the economist stream. You have discounted investment appraisal with pricing at long run marginal cost. Well, why can't we have this in Britain? Well, it seems we might move towards this, because in Scotland, the Mackenzie Committee was established to discuss should the north and south of Scottish electricity boards be merged. The economists were really getting very excited because, of course, if they did merge to become a Scottish electricity board, the hydro works would just stop. Why wouldn't you just generate thermally in the south and transmit up to the north? The report came out in '62 and said, yes, you should merge. This is a nonsense. And the cabinet, showing political strength in the approach to election, rejected it. The Treasury went mildly ape and said, you cannot talk to us about public expenditure crises, misuse of resources, etc., and yet prevent this crucial issue going through. And from that point forward, so the next two planned reservoirs or works were at Fadafin and Leyden, the Treasury insisted on applying this test discount rate, saying, well, if your returns are what you expect them to be, I want to discount them back. I don't want you just to tell me what it costs to build, and can you cover the interest rates? I want to know what the returns are on a discounted basis. Now, all of this is watched and used by the Treasury. So the Treasury has watched the French experience throughout the 1950s. It's had its chance in the hydro collapse to really get in there and stop hydro, and it begins to make this the basis of its approach towards capital investment. And the key people here are Michael Posner, who was a professor of economics at Pembroke, Cambridge, and also Ralph Turvey. Ralph Turvey, incredibly important, and both wrote major texts on electricity economics. Ralph Turvey in 67 and Posner 73. So what I'm going to start arguing to you is that the changes in the approach towards capital investment have a lot to do with French electricity. And what we're seeing here is a shift from what does it cost, what we call the ex post, what did it cost, what returns might we get from it, to ex ante, what are the returns if we do it? We haven't done it yet. Ex ante, what happens if we think forward? Heavily influenced by the French and this man, Maurice Allais. Maurice Allais, Nobel Prize winner in 1988, but pretty unknown within Europe during the 40s and 50s. Why? Because he wrote long mathematical books in French. Never a good way to make your name in career terms. But professor of economics at the École des Mines in 1944, and he educated a complete generation of French economists. So Boitier, who goes on to run Électricité de France, is taught by Allais at Place Saint-Sulpice, Café Serran, upper room, you go visit if you like, taught econometrics by him. He teaches Gérard Debreu, Malenvaux, teaches a whole generation. Also teaches people like Massey, who we already met with regard to investment, who goes on to run French economic planning. The third plan is headed up by Massey. So what you find is that all these technocratic economists come to assume major positions of power in France. So Massey in planning, Boitier as head of EDF, and Allais himself is incredibly powerful, has huge impact. So for example, 1958, there's a huge energy crisis because coal supplies are suddenly in surplus for the first time. Coal rationing does end in Britain in 1958 because it just do not do the stuff. What happens in Britain? Are we go into a deep funk and we put taxes on everything just to try and gender up a false demand for coal? What does Allais do? He stages a series of seminars in École des Mines, and ministers come, heads of all the industries come, and they all sit and listen to Allais. And if you go and read Annales des Mines, which I'm sure you're all desperate to do, you can read the full text of this professor of economics telling the government and its major industrial leaders what it should be doing. It's really a sort of economist's dream here. And here are some of these. This actually is Allais when he came to Edinburgh for the bicentenary of the Adam Smith lectures. And you know Adam Smith, as you know, is buried down in the Canongate. There's no sign to it, but even if you go there at night, from the graves comes the invisible hand to guide you. There we are, Nick. There's your joke. Right. Okay. So what we're getting here is a shift in how we think about capital investment through the energy route. We're not thinking, what does it cost? Can we cover the costs? Let's all get on. We're thinking, what are the returns? And not just what returns can we get from current assets, but what are the future discounted returns? And we need to think about all investment as in a system. It's an interconnected system. And what we're edging towards here is really what we would call an ex-ante marginalist systematic approach. It's looking at the additional investment at each point. If I do this, what's the additional effect? What's the additional social benefit and cost? And that, as I say, is really picked up by Ralph Turvey, who is this expert in electricity economics, and is brought in to start writing not just the electricity guidelines in the 1960s, but all of the white papers on the nationalised industries. All of them are going to be taken in under this new approach, not looking back, not ex post, but ex ante. So this is just a Turveyism, and I'll come back to why this is important later on. There's no difference between teaching undergraduate civil servants, except the latter set the examination paper. And this man, Maurice Peston, is Robert Peston's father. So Robert Peston, you know, we're all drowning. Maurice Peston is Robert Peston's father. I've said that, it hasn't changed much. So, and the point is that you begin to get this shift from ex post to ex ante, affecting all sorts of other areas where you hadn't really thought that it would affect. And essentially what you see here is the triumph of the increasing engagement of microeconomics within public expenditure. So I would say you even see it in Norman Lamont's PFI initiatives. You push future returns ahead, and therefore you can really if you like, put your costs against as they go along. You certainly see it in hospitals, the development of the National Health Service of these QALYs, these quality adjusted life years. Who gets the HIP? How many do they, well, how many do you get? You know, but who gets the HIP? In which parts of the country do you get? All these thoughts begin to be developed, particularly places like University of York, the Centre for Health Economics, begins to move upon this marginal systematic basis. And Rudolf Klein, in his History of the NHS, notes that the economists come to be the keepers of the grail of efficiency. Maurice Peston himself is asked to do the work on education, about school leaving age, and raises this point I'll show you in a minute. And there's also a rather spooky development, which I'll show you in a minute, concerning which roads do you and do you not improve. This is also really the start of the development of behavioral economics. How do you begin to influence people's behavior for the future? All right, let's start with Maurice Peston. So, a simple issue like school leaving age. School leaving age was raised in 1947 from 14 to 15, but it wasn't raised again from 15 to 16 until 1973. Butler Report 44 said you should do this quickly. The Crowther Report of 59 said you should do this quickly, but nothing actually happened. And what you see here is Maurice Peston saying, why are you doing this? Why are you developing? Why are you offering a greater supply of education? What are the marginal benefits? And this is the start of the who benefits. Is it a public benefit or is it a private benefit? The more you educate people, the more do you slip into private benefits beginning to dominate public benefits. That is picked up in turn by Lionel Robbins, author of the report on the expansion of university education. And often in the context of student fees, people say, oh, well, this is a complete renunciation of Robbins. But it isn't. Robbins at the time wanted fees. They wanted loans and not grants. They felt they couldn't do it because not insufficient people were aware of the benefits of higher education. Just take that on trust, all right? So the benefits of higher education. But it's interesting that even in 1964, Lionel Robbins is beginning to peck away and say, what about loans? What about making people pay for private benefits, private marginal benefits? And indeed, by 1971, the Treasury is drawing up a graduate tax. And this is the weird one. This is the one that makes you go, whoa. If you shift from ex post to ex ante, you think differently about dead people. From 1930 till 1969, the Road Research Laboratory used to compute road deaths in terms of the loss of the person who had died and the loss, therefore, of his or her economic output. But from that, you would subtract their consumption, because dead people don't eat. And therefore, you would have a net amount with which you would then run. Well, that's very ex post. That's saying it's happened. How do we think about it? But now let's go ex ante. Let's think about the future. Then you stop thinking in terms of what's the cost of those who's died. You think, what's the benefit of stopping people dying? What's the VPF? What's the value of prevented fatalities? And this does something to your calculation. You still have the value of their economic output. So that is factored in. But of course, they continue to eat because they are now alive. And people enjoy eating. We're not going to go to the behavioral economics of eating, but people enjoy eating, and therefore they derive utility. And therefore their value ex ante rises, in fact doubles in 1969, simply because of this technical switch in time perspective. And you can see that there's a fairly general increase in this estimation of the value of life. But of course, once you start to think, well, if we repair this road crossing, the following people of the following value don't die, you can begin to identify what type of people are dying and which are the ones worth saving. And this is precisely what they do. So we know that in towns, the safest place to be is inside the car. And the most dangerous place to be is on the pavement. But the economic value of people on the pavement is less than those in the car. People on the pavement are pensioners or they're small children. And pensioners, we know, have a very low economic value. they must have some what we call warm-blooded costs, which must be the state pension that we pay to keep them alive for some emotional reason. So, and these are the issues which are discussed in the 1970s. What are people worth? And they begin to break it down by who's driving on which roads. So they get very concerned about young motorcyclists bombing around and killing themselves, huge waste of resources. And therefore they begin to break it down by gender, almost by race, by age, etc., etc., etc. What you then get into is a very difficult ethical area, much more difficult even than the area of who gets hospital operations. And this really is the area of who do you save? For which types do you actually undertake the capital investment? And this was raised very strongly by Gavin Mooney, originally an Aberdonian economist who went to work at the Department of Treasury, and very sadly was murdered by his partner's son in Tasmania in December 2012. You've probably heard about that on the news. It may not have meant as much to you as it did to me, but a bit of a Christmas shock. Okay, so you can see that there are real issues emerging in this ex-ante system-based marginalist approach. Now, all of this is happening in the good times. Between the 50s and the 60s, when actually, okay, we had public expenditure crises, but actually, okay, total managed expenditure runs ahead of current receipts, but that's because the government is borrowing more because it wants to. In fact, you have budget surpluses from 1947 right through to 1974. The budget is really in surplus throughout this whole period. So this is happening in the good period. You can see where this might lead when things get tough. Now, there's one part of this provisionist collectivist state that I've simply ignored, and that's housing. If you think about the Attlee government, 200,000 houses being built a year, Macmillan's 300,000 houses being built a year, 9/10 of those built by the Attlee government are council houses. They are just given to people on an appoint system, butchers, bankers, candlestick makers, all put together, usually around a swing park in concentric circles. And you can see that in this data here. What's interesting is that dwellings, as a percentage of our total GDFCF, remain fairly constant, but there is this high point for the state. These are council houses, which then steadily falls over this post-war period and is replaced by private investment. So council houses, dwellings, begin to fall as a part of economic activity. And you can have this in any which way you like. This is someone with a misspent Sunday morning playing around with charts. And if you want to see the figures, you can see this swap around. 3% from private in 50, 16% from public in 50, and almost reversed, 2.7 from public in 94 and 18.2% in 94 from private. But notice that the share of investment remains broadly predictable, broadly the same. But what's interesting about this is that although the share of investment remains the same, the number of houses falls quite rapidly, i.e. you can invest the same but get fewer places in which to live. And that, of course, then raises issues, not if I stop building privately, will it affect the rate of investment? The answer is no. Will it affect the number of houses? Quite possibly yes. So why did the state sell off council houses? Well, here we have a rather curious story, which is to do with the productivity of house construction. I told you there are no jokes. What happened was that productivity in housing fell behind productivity within the economy as a whole. So labour costs tended to be dragged up. And also land costs rose as land through Town and Country Planning Acts became more expensive. Now, when they'd originally built council houses in the 40s and 50s, the idea was that you borrowed in order to build them, but you then spread the costs of building them across the total stock of housing. Everyone just paid rent sufficient to cover the costs. But clearly, if your costs are rising, then your rents will also be rising to cover these costs. And this became politically difficult to carry through. So you get to the 70s where you really are beginning to get economic problems. So unemployment's beginning to head towards 1 million. Heath government's just lost the election of 74, and the Treasury is now saying, well, housing is an important part of capital investment, we must have rates of return. Now, if you charge rates of return of 3%, which are unspectacular, rents will go up 50%, and if you charge 10%, well, they're simply going to become more expensive than private housing. So the Labour Party begins to push for council houses to be sold. So this is Peter Shaw, this is Peter Shaw saying we need to give strong encouragement for home ownership. The gains would be enormous. Not only is it what most people want, but they're prepared to pay more for it out of their own pockets. Why do they want to shed stock? They want to shed stock in part because they think they have some surplus stock, but also to try and get rent down. They really are trying to get rid of almost the better stock. And that decision, that push by Shaw, comes out of a meeting at Chequers in the summer of '75, where there was very great enthusiasm by the Labour government for the sale of council houses. And you can see the effects of that on this figure here, the effects of that and of nationalised industries, which privatised, which I can come back to in questions if you like, in the levels of the public sector stock. It gradually falls from its height in the early 80s, 77% GDP, right down to 15.6% by the end of the century. Well, so what? Well, the so what really is that where does it put us in terms of today? This isn't something that's just come out. This is a book in 1947. This is by Roy Harrod, who is important because when Keynes wrote the general theory, 3 economists went to him with papers explaining what he'd written for a conference. One was Harrod, whose paper Keynes liked the most. One was Mead, whose paper Keynes quite liked, but not quite as much. And one was John Hicks, whose paper Keynes did not like at all. And Hicks's paper really became the basis for the ISLM curve and most of the textbook explanations of Keynesianism. So there you are. And Roy Harrod is the father, as I was discussing with Trevor before, and Adam, of Dominic Harrod, the BBC's economic correspondent. There's huge feudalism in the economics world. Douglas J breeds Peter J, and Peter J marries Jim Callahan's wife, and so it goes on. All right, so are these hardships necessary? And what's it got to do with capital investment? Well, I know we have national debt, but let's not get overexcited. We've always had national debt. And indeed, national debt was really quite high after World War II. Wars tend to be rather deficit-incurring, debt-making activities. And we have national debt, but so do many other countries. If you want to get more historic about it, that post-Napoleonic War period was really a bad time. The national debt was much higher than we're used to. And if you want to just capture the size of the current preoccupation, it's like down there. So we have a debt problem, but in historic terms, the economic historian is not unduly fretting. What we have had, though, in the current period is something of a marked turn down in capital investment. And that really is quite a significant development. Does it matter? Well, the obvious comparison, and I believe the one which Bill Keegan's made in his recent book, and which Nick Macpherson of the Treasury was talking about when he got into trouble about the Labour government did not cause the current crash. The obvious comparison is with the Attlee government. The Attlee government was this post-war government in 1945, had very high national debt to GDP ratios, yet built council houses, nationalised industries, had a huge surge in capital investment. This is a government which has overseen something of a sharp drop in capital investment. And we can start to play that party game loved by historians and economic historians of what would Keynes have done were he here today? Well, I owe this reference to Angus Armstrong, who of the National Institute Economic Review, National Institute of Economics, who pointed out to me that Keynes actually wrote a series of articles in 1933 called The Means to Prosperity. So not grand theory, just a series of very simple ideas as to how you chugged your way out of a recession through growth. And he begins by saying you should make bank credit cheap, abundant, and available. Well, not sure how abundant it is, but we've certainly gone down the cheap money route. Even when we've reached the second stage, it's very unlikely that private enterprise will of its own initiative undertake new loan expenditure on a sufficient scale. And he really draws attention to what he regards as fairly safe investments that the state could begin to undertake or indeed encourage others to undertake. And if we go in reverse order, roads and railways, then public utilities, and finally dwellings. Well, I'm not going to bore you with my rant about roads and railways. I used to rant about the tram, but then HS2 came along. And if you want a classic case of using upfront capital for not very clear rates of return at discounted value, then those must be it. What I think is quite interesting, and why I referred you to Turvey's remark to Peston about exam papers, is really concerns public utilities. So I was involved like to 0.000% in the discussions about the commissioning of new electricity generating plant. Now, the real trick in introducing competition into these industries, when we had that, isn't just to get lower prices and more efficiency, because that's just essentially sweating the existing assets. It's to get people to invest for the next generation. Where is the next generation of power stations going to come from? And when I used to go and speak at the Department of Energy and Climate Change, I would say to them, you do realize that what you're doing has never ever been attempted before. That to deliver capital investment in industries like electricity in competitive states is really very difficult. So the Victorians, that Turvey used to write about, used to have concessions. You would get a concession for 21 or 42 years, however long it was, where essentially you would be given the monopoly, subject to regulated rates of return, and you would go in ahead and invest, you would deliver the plant, and you would then operate it, and you would in a sense be regulated on that. But you knew you were going to get an assured rate of return back from it. We then built a national grid, which provided very good demand, and of course then we had nationalisation, which created monopolies. So you never worried in the electricity monopoly about, will I get my money back, because it was a monopoly. But here we are, for the first time, trying to induce private investors to put up sunk capital. Once you've built the nuclear plant, there's nothing you can do with it, in a competitive market. We're not offering them regulated rate of returns. We're not even telling them what the price of the next energy source will be. And we're talking all the time about these strike prices. And, well, I'm on camera, so I won't get too rude. But if you look at the contract for Hinkley Point C at the moment, it's unduly expensive. Now, why does this happen? Well, I think one little reason is that there aren't enough historians, and certainly economic historians, around. So you go and talk to Department of Energy, and everyone's 12. They're all very young, and they're all lovely. The median age at the Treasury is currently 31. That's the median age of the Treasury. And you say to the Treasury, how are you getting on in preparing for the next government? The 15 briefs you're writing for the 15 forms of government that come in. And they go, yeah, well, it's going all right, Martin, thanks very much. And I say, well, how does it compare with last time? And they say, well, we don't really know, because only 10% of the staff at the Treasury today were here at the last election. So a huge churn of very, very young people. These nice young people, they're the people running you. So I think, so when you go and say to them, but we've never ever tried to deliver capital investment in competitive markets, they go, oh, I didn't know that. Because, of course, they don't have a background of history. And one of the things which economic history gives you is this background of experience. So I'm not here to sell you something. All right, and let's get on to the last of Keynes's triumvirates, housing. Oh dear. Well, I have an interest here as the father of children who pay London rents, and I'm not very impressed. There is a housing shortage. That seems fairly clear, but the housing shortage is not entirely due to a failure to build more houses. We could build more houses, and indeed, given that debt is very cheap to finance at the moment, you would have thought there was scope for building houses, so that's the cost of raising the money, and then charging people social rents, which were social but nonetheless higher than the costs of actually financing the construction. We could, in fact, exchange debt for a reduction in structural deficit. But that doesn't appear to be happening, although we're always promised after every election some new wonderful garden city. Thank you, Mr. Clegg. So there is this issue about why can't we simply build more houses? But there's a deeper issue, which is about how well do we use the existing stock that we have. Now, when the Labour government was discussing the sale of council houses, It wasn't simply discussing that on its own. It was talking about how do we use the housing stock in general. And there was a huge argument between Douglas Wass and Ian Byatt and others about this. The intention was to reintroduce Schedule A taxation on owner occupation. So anyone who owns a house receives what's called an imputed rent. So if you swapped houses with your neighbour and you paid rent, you would be taxed on that rent. So the idea was to tax people on imputed income. That would therefore treat it as an investment, and they would therefore get MIRAS tax relief, mortgage tax relief, because it was an investment. That idea was knocked on the head, but MIRAS was retained. The other feature which was retained was the exemption from capital gains tax of first homes. And indeed, the exemption of all homes from capital gains tax if you happen to die in possession of 10 homes. So therefore, you begin to get this huge mismatch between the rates of return enjoyed, largely untaxed, and the gains enjoyed untaxed by owner-occupiers, and the rents which are being paid at tax rents by basically our children. And the idea in the 70s was to sort this out, and it was fudged. We got the sale of the council stock, we got encouragement to buy, but we didn't get the taxation of imputed income of owner occupations. Well, that's it really. So this really is a discussion of capital investment. So I'm sorry about that. To the historians, I would say, it's relatively free of politics. It's a fundamental change in how we think about capital investment, which I think explains not a lot, but an important part of how the nature of the state has changed from 1945 to our current day. It's free of that, Mrs. Thatcher bad, somebody else good. It's just a discussion of how capital investment works and how the state's view, ex post, ex ante, marginal, systems-based, has changed. I've been concerned here with the nature of time. The benefit of talking about time is you know you're going to finish on time. It's good not to finish dead on time, obviously. I think, how long can I milk this? I think we might have some time for questions, but I think it's certainly time for a drink. So thank you for your time.
I was just wondering, Martin, in the broad sweep of history which you've looked at, if we had the understanding of economics which you have, would we have built less or built more? Is there a sort of general way that the fact we aren't as expert in economics as we ought to be, where we're not able to understand economics in the longer term particularly, does this mean, broadly speaking, we build less or we build more?
I think it's a very good question, Richard. I think if anyone, so we're talking here about basically sunk investment which once you undertake, there's not a huge amount you can do with it. And I think it isn't really to do with ownership or private-public, it's to do with offering investors some, not guarantee, but some less uncertainty about the rate of return they are likely to get on the investment which they undertake. And that, I think, is Keynes' meaning of the socialization of investment. He is saying, let the state take projects which we clearly need. So roads, rail, houses, energy. And let the state offer investors some surety of rate of return. It's not going to be excessive because you can control that, but give them some greater certainty about what rates of return they will get. And Keynes is saying, Keynes doesn't actually want the state to be involved in doing it. He wants the state to be there offering this socialized rate of return, this socialization of the expected marginal efficiency of investment. And that, I think, is what we miss. And it varies the degree of uncertainty between markets. So you have to think case by case. You know, grand political gestures, or we don't do this and we do this, well, we all know they're just ridiculous. So we need to think case by case. And yes, it would be good if people knew more economics, wouldn't it, Simon? It would just be fantastic. And we do have an example in the French. You see, the French is a wonderful example because EDF still today effectively runs as a publicly owned monopoly. I know the European directives say it shouldn't be a monopoly, but you try competing against an incumbent nuclear power generator. You could say, well, why didn't they privatize? Well, I remember sitting next to Marcel Boiteux in 1996 and giving a paper saying, oh, the English and Welsh did this, and we separated off the grid from that. And he just pushed out a paper about half an hour later and saying, vachement Anglo-Saxon, very Anglo-Saxon, and just a sort of fruitcake type thing, association with pricing. And essentially what EDF did was that EDF said to their industry, okay, there is a public expenditure constraint here, we can't publicly finance you forever. It let them go and raise money on the international capital markets, the contrat de plan of 69 and 70. So you can have a nationalized monopoly which raises money independently and then, of course, comes into our market saying, oh, of course, we don't really believe in competition, but then clears up in the nuclear market. And, of course, you bury certain costs. So we don't really know yet what the decommissioning costs of French nuclear is. But socialization of rate of return is a very interesting idea, funny enough, that Keynes has. So I think it's been my answer.
I'm not an economist, but I'm wondering, just to look to the future, with PFI on the rise and with students with sizable amounts more debt than I had when I left university to come and work for it, I'm just wondering if you can think about looking to the future. I'm thinking the future generation has less housing stock, more debt. Do you think there'll be policy shifts from all these young Treasury people and such like, or are you predicting more of the same?
Well, no, because I gave a paper really on the Mead reports of 75, I don't go 78, to the Treasury, who said, great, thank you very much. Can we get politicians to go with it? The idea is that you tax people. The idea is that you deal with the distribution of wealth. And the idea is what's called a PAYWAT, is that you tax on a rising scale the transfer of unearned income or unearned wealth. So you receive, I don't know, £50,000, and you don't pay any tax on that, but we keep a stock of your accumulation of wealth. And as that stock rises, we then charge a rising marginal rate. In addition, we think that you'll live to 85, unless you walk on pavements. So we think you'll walk to 85, and we tax you according to the difference between your current age and the age of 85, and we run that tax backwards. So there is a very clear motivation or an interest in changing the, if you like, the asset structure, changing the distribution of wealth. And that seems to me, and this isn't just because of Piketty and people, this seems to me to be one of the key issues. Students' loans, I actually am in favour of student fees, so you know, because it seems to me the cost of coming to university isn't fees, it's the opportunity cost of not going to work. That surely is the income foregone. And indeed, that's a good way to think about it. I didn't mention this, but when they were privatising council houses, Jack Straw and Michael Hestine had a huge bust up in 1979 about, oh, we can't sell council houses for less than they cost to build, blah, blah, blah. And the economic historians will recognise his name. James Foreman Peck, who was then a young lecturer in the Department of Economics in Newcastle, wrote in and said, that is completely the wrong way to think about assets. So whenever you sell assets, be it the post office or Lloyds Bank, whatever it is, you should think, what future income am I foregoing by selling this asset? So given that rents were rising in council houses and were likely to rise, why not think to yourself, oh, well, we can sell them, or we can keep those rents for the years ahead. So bizarrely, they actually went ex post again and said, what do they cost? Do we cover the cost? But what you should really do is think ex ante, what's the future hold? And if I can just slightly deviate from the point and get a tiny bit political, the big issues, which will cost you money, are old age care. Has that been discussed in any election? It is the big issue for many households, much, much more than university fees. University fees, you presumably get jobs and you have time in which to repay them. Care of your parents and of yourself, that is what will take your income and your wealth away. And that is not discussed. We had the Dilnot report, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, which seemed to be a very competent report, as you expect from Andrew Dilnot, and it's just been dumped. But, so if you ask me what affects your lifestyle in the future, I'd say looking after old people.
Okay, thank you. Well, on that note, and noting the time, actually, and being old myself, note that afterwards we've no ice creams, and you've waited a long time for them, but you are allowed 2 glasses of wine, 2 glasses of juice, and as many nibbles as you would like. Upstairs in the Macmillan room, I'm sure that some people in the room know how to find the Macmillan room. The talk, yes? Some people know how to get to Macmillan room? Okay, so follow those people who think that they know the direction to go. Hopefully you choose the right ones upstairs. But I'd like you to join me in closing to thank Martin for what was a really excellent and entertaining and non-dismal and non-dry presentation. Martin, thank you very much.